South Korea has one of the most charged political landscapes on the planet. What is today outwardly seen as a successful democracy, lying in stark contrast to its problematic brother in the north, has not really been around that long. Just over 30 years ago, the country was under authoritarian martial law leadership, and the only reason we didn't hear about it as much was arguably because they were on our side of the Cold War. Now, political and economic liberalisation since then has made South Korea one of the wealthiest and safest countries in Asia, but the systems that allowed 5 different regimes with varying levels of authoritarianism to hold power over just 3 decades never really went away. South Korea has been enjoying the benefits of representative governance, but under the surface, it's one of the most politically divided nations on the planet in one of the most dangerous ways. That, combined with the fact that the miraculous economic growth of previous decades is turning into a prolonged stagnation, means that the pie is no longer growing larger and the people are just fighting over their share of it. The country is a bit of a powder keg for leaders to come along and say that they have the solutions to these problems. Now, of course, the reason we're making this video is that just earlier this month, the president once again tried to bring South Korea back under martial law, which shocked the world. But given the country's history and current problems, it probably shouldn't be that shocking at all. What's more is that it's probably just the first sign of things to come, not only in South Korea, but in a lot of countries that are feeling the pressure of a shifting global economy. If anything, South Korea is just ahead of the curve. So, why is South Korea so politically divided? What has accelerated this division? And finally, could other supposedly stable democracies be in for the same kind of shake-up? South Korea is a country that was reborn out of the ashes of a brutal conflict that cost millions of lives and destroyed what little wealth it had left. Even before the Korean War, Japanese occupation of the peninsula had wiped out governing structures, cultural traditions, and even started to phase out the Korean language itself in a process called Japanization. Conditions for native Koreans under occupation were brutal, and many were forced into constructing railways and mines to assist the Japanese in extracting the peninsula's resources to fuel their growing empire. Now, this could have at least given the peninsula an infrastructure base to fuel their own development post-occupation, but unfortunately, most of this was destroyed in the following Korean War. In the first half of the 20th century, there was probably no worse place on Earth to live than on the Korean peninsula, and that time period was not exactly a barrel of laughs for most other countries as well. The scars of occupation and war still live on in Korea today and define its geopolitical landscape. Of course, the most notable sign of this being the east-west divide along the 38th parallel, but there are also other, less obvious issues that live on as well. Japan is now technically one of South Korea's closest allies in the region. They have very close trade and military relations, but this is a complicated partnership for the actual people that make up these countries. Japan has barely officially recognised its atrocities during occupation in the Second World War, and even modern-day politicians have tried to downplay these issues to varying levels of success, including a recent former Prime Minister claiming that Koreans were not slave labourers, they were just requisitioned to work against their will. Which, yeah, alright. Now, in an attempt to stop the spread of communism and build up allies in the area, the US invested heavily into these economies post-war, so they were largely forced to get along, even if genuine popular support wasn't really there. Now, the fact that government systems had been wiped out by occupation, the country was set up to serve a small group of colonisers, and add the fact that all the new governments had to do to hold on to their positions was to keep some foreign entities happy, it shouldn't have been a surprise when both sides of the peninsula fell under authoritarian rule. For the north, it was obviously the rise of the Kim family under their communist regime, and in the south, it was a series of political coups that seized power away while the populace remained under martial law. Even to this day, the same political dynamics make the country very susceptible to strongman leadership. It might not be the USSR anymore, but there is another growing power in the region that the West is very motivated to maintain, and vice versa for North Korea. The inherent division that comes from, well, dividing the peninsula has become a useful tool for either side of the DMZ to keep control over the strings of political power. Rival political groups, dissenters, or even critical media outlets can all be branded as South Korean or North Korean sympathisers and either be arrested or just discredited. Now, obviously today, this is far worse in North Korea, but it still happens all the time in the South. The attempt at declaring martial law that captured global attention just earlier this month was motivated, or at least justified, by rooting out anti-state actors. Now, politicians using a common enemy or trying to make one up to unify their people behind them is absolutely nothing new, and just because it's a little bit more obvious in North and South Korea doesn't mean that it's anything special by itself. But what is interesting is why it's becoming so important. Obviously, in the North, living conditions for average people are absolutely terrible. Starvation, oppression, and no indication that things are ever going to get better are obviously not politically popular platforms. Now, obviously, elections are not really a thing up there, but it's still important to give even an oppressed population someone else to hate. Now again, the South by comparison is now a utopia. It's been decades since the country was under the rule of martial law, the people are on average far wealthier, and they have the small added benefit of the fact that if they want to leave, they can. But that's not to say that the country doesn't have very real problems. Most of you watching are probably coming from the Economics Explained video where we covered the issue of their concentrated megacorporations. These companies exert so much pressure over the population that people push themselves for years of ultra-competitive school and university to get a job at one of these companies because it's hard to get ahead working anywhere else. This has created a situation where even though headline living standard metrics look pretty good, educational attainment is high, life expectancy is long, infant mortality is low, and incomes are on average pretty strong, the real quality of life that people experience is not that great. And the problems start from birth. Children are drilled with intense education from a young age, with parents spending tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars on tutoring, and when they grow up, if they are lucky, they'll get a job where they're expected to work very long hours in a highly urbanised city. If they are unlucky, they'll be expected to work very long hours in a highly urbanised city, but also live in a rundown housing district. This means that even though by the numbers South Koreans are doing pretty well, most of them are living tough lives just to keep up in a country that's been designed around serving a small handful of companies. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these harsh conditions have contributed massively to possibly the country's most immediate and existential problem. It's going extinct. South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world, which when combined with a high life expectancy means it will soon have too many old people to support. Young people largely don't want to have children, and even those who do are finding it really hard because the years where they would start a family are defined by working long hours, living in small, cramped city apartments, and struggling to make ends meet. Of course, this is not a problem unique to South Korea, but here it's pushed to the extreme. The burden of having a child is higher because for them to get ahead or simply just not fall behind, they would also need intense schooling and extracurricular activities, which are not only a huge investment of time and money for the parents as well, who probably don't have a lot of time or money, but it's also just a Sisyphean struggle. People are grinding themselves to death and realising they probably don't want to have kids who are also going to have to struggle through the same system they did. Instead, it's becoming a lot easier for people to opt out of the system and just get angry instead. Conditions may not be as oppressive as in the north, but that can actually make things harder to control. The population is wealthy enough to not have to worry where their next meal is coming from, which gives them the capacity to be politically active and try to push to fix their problems, which is great. That's the point of democracy, if it works as intended. The harsh reality of the country's current political and economic climate doesn't necessarily mix that well with their very traditional values. Now, of course, the big disclaimer here is that this does not apply to everyone, but when painting a picture of the entire country and its surrounding region, it pays to use broad strokes. South Korea is one of the most divided countries in the world along gender lines, with Korean men being overwhelmingly conservative and Korean women pushing for liberalisation, especially in a few key areas. Again, as a direct result of their history and troublesome neighbours, men have compulsory military service with very few exceptions. In an environment as competitive for workers as South Korea, this is a big disadvantage for men who have to give up between 18 and 21 months of their lives to serve right at the very start of their career. To try and make up for that little disadvantage, there are government programs to make men more employable, but finding that balance is next to impossible, so the gender pay gap in South Korea is massive by advanced economic standards. Understandably, women who are also working long hours under immense pressure to try and keep up in such a competitive place are not too happy about this. But attempts to rebalance the programs to help men are pushed back on hard. There's also the belief that generally women should be homemakers, so their pay is not as important, but in an age where not a lot of people are starting traditional families, and even if they do, it's unlikely that they'll be able to afford a stay-at-home wife, these traditional ideals are butting up against a harsh economic reality. Now, immense competition, personal sacrifice, and hard work are always going to be tough pills to swallow, but people will generally put up with it if they see that they're making a better life for themselves and their family. Unfortunately, as we saw in the EE video, their economy is stagnating as their ultra-concentrated businesses are being outcompeted by global rivals. And never mind making a better life for their families, most young Koreans are never going to have families of their own. Politically, it's a landscape where people are highly divided by age, gender, whether they're employed by one of the big companies or not, education, and even if they live in Seoul or the rest of the country. This is to say nothing of the various and very intense religious, special interest and cult groups because, yeah, there are a lot of those. So many that they probably warrant their own video, so subscribe because we will probably do that here on this channel soon. Either way, with so much division between these groups, it leaves very little room to navigate these pressing issues, and ultimately it has proven to be much easier to just keep the big corporations happy, because they, at the very least, are organised. After the declaration of martial law and the following impeachment, the country is in limbo. The president was still technically in power, but he was not allowed to leave the country for fears that he may flee before he can be put on trial for attempted treason. After a second round of impeachment votes that happened while this video was going together, he was suspended, and the country's prime minister started filling in executive duties until an emergency election can be carried out. But it's possible that by the time you're watching this, things could have changed again, and that's exactly the problem. All of this would be bad in any country, but given how important South Korea is to the balance of power, many are afraid of what even this temporary hiccup could allow in such a sensitive region. It's a political powder keg zip-tied to the world's scrotum. Now, there is probably a lot to be learned from this. Our own countries are going to have to start dealing with the low birth rate problem very soon, and for now, most Western countries have been able to hide low birth rates with immigration, but that's come with problems of its own, both political and economic. If anything, Korea is just ahead of the curve and is a good look into the future we could be in for in the coming decades. The only reason it doesn't get more attention is because of its problematic siblings stealing the bad news spotlight. Now, we've already made an entire video on the unique challenge that North Korea presents to the outside world, and just for fun ran through a scenario where all-out war does happen on the peninsula. You should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.